I would like to welcome to the University of Lincoln, Linda KK, a researcher in cyber psychology, and who's going to be talking to us today about the understanding online behaviours and how to relate to online learning success. And I think that's, given the topic of today's presentation, is a critical thing for us to consider and explore and learn from. And really looking forward to this morning's session. So we've got about 50 minutes for this. Well, I think we're going to save at least 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions at the end. So please, if you've got any questions, type them into the chat box. Let's have a dialogue afterwards and see what we can learn and what we can share with each other. So I think we're just about on time now. So Linda, I will hand over to you. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, first of all, to the conference committee for inviting me to do a keynote at this event. There have been some really great talks so far. When I was first asked to do a keynote at this event, at first I thought, what on earth am I going to talk about? And it took me a bit of time to kind of throw around a few ideas to know, first of all, what might be A, interesting, but B, probably more importantly, what might be useful. And so I've kind of ran a few ideas past Dan, one of the conference committee, and eventually sort of came up with something which hopefully solves both of those two remits. You might be wondering why I've got the term online in brackets as part of my title, and I suppose I'm a big advocate for this idea that, particularly in higher education, we're not just situating learning as taking place in one setting. And I think this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about blended learning and teaching, in that just because we might be doing stuff online doesn't mean that that's where the learning is happening. It can translate and be fluid across contexts. So that was probably just me being really pedantic when I was coming up with my title. So I'll talk a little bit about my background and the area I work in and how this has sort of come about as we go through, but I'm really looking forward to sharing some insights with you today. So what I eventually came up with when thinking about what might be A, interesting and B, useful, were two main themes. And possibly the first theme might seem a little bit left field. And what I'd ask is just really bear with me, because what will start to hopefully happen is realising what the relevance of these things are to the issues at hand today, and of course in moving forward. But secondly, what the second theme around connection does is kind of resolve some of the kind of open questions that end up getting posed from the first part of this talk. So just bear with me, I guess, is the thing I'm just asking of you as we go through this talk, and hopefully some of ideas might sort of start to come together as we get to the end. So these are some of the things I'll be drawing on in this talk. So this really comes together from the work I do in the area of cyber psychology. So I'm aware that there might be a range of understandings in today's audience about what this is. But basically, I mean, my background is psychology. That's the bread and butter of the work I do. But psychology is actually a very broad discipline. And cyber psychology is just one aspect of this, and very much an emerging field within psychology, but essentially is really, really relevant actually for a lot of today's societal issues, and particularly in the context of things like online learning and blended learning, really has a lot of relevance. So essentially it's the psychology of how we interact, engage and are affected by new technologies and aspects of the internet. So it has a great deal of relevance really for today's session. So that's my primary area of research and specialism, but I do have a great deal of interest and enthusiasm in the psychology of learning and teaching as well. And I teach second year educational psychology students this at my university. And what this talk has actually done really well, which is something that doesn't happen very often, is actually bring those two interests together. Ironically, that doesn't tend to happen. So I've been really grateful for the opportunity to actually draw those insights together for once. So just to give you a little bit more background about what I do, the bread and butter of what I do is I'm an academic and do teaching and research, predominantly in cyber psychology, but as I mentioned, the psychology of learning and teaching as well. But I'm really lucky to have had loads of opportunities to apply cyber psychology in lots of different ways. So I do quite a lot of media engagement, public engagement events, because of course a lot of cyber psychology issues to do with things like this so-called term of screen time and all this sort of stuff. It's very sort of public facing and about informing societal debate. So, a lot of that is very public facing kind of work that I do. I also lead on doing stuff with the cyber psychology section, which is about, I suppose, regulating and understanding the progression of cyber psychology as an academic area, but also a policy area. And I do sort of consultancy as well with stakeholders such as technological companies to work with stakeholders on how we can apply these insights for users and technology companies. So really, lots of the stuff I do is bringing a lot of these different ideas together. So start with thinking about online behaviours, and this sort of encompasses under a broader sort of area of what we might call technology or internet use. So what I'm going to sort of talk through is how this actually is a lot more complicated and more complex than we might sort of think. So when we're thinking about online learning or student or tutors' behaviours around this actually is a one bigger aspect of this more complex term of what we might call technology or internet use. But the trouble with this is this technology internet use actually has numerous constituent parts, and what I want to do is sort of draw on each of these to kind of illuminate the relevance of these to the issues that we are currently dealing with, I guess, in this particular context. So when we think about why we use technology or technology use itself, the first thing we have to actually understand is, why do we use it in the first place? What are the factors that are relevant to help us understand why we use things? And then there's other things which I'll go on to talk about as we go through. So looking at the first issue of what we might call technology or internet adoption. This essentially is helping us understand why we might start using technology in the first place. Now, the psychology of this is a lot of this has been underpinned by what's called the technology acceptance model. And what this basically suggests is that the likelihood of you using a certain technology or any kind of online sort of setting or platform is very much driven by two main perceptions that you have as an individual. One, how useful you deem that technology to be, and secondly, how much you perceive it is easy to use. And this essentially is very much encompassed with other kinds of factors as well, such as external things like, do you have the facilitating conditions to be able to do this? Do you have institutional support, for example? Are there any technical issues or security issues with this? Of course, what we have in the context of COVID is actually a really big external variable, which is the pressure of you've got to do everything online because we can't physically be on campus, which is very much driving and interfering a lot of the time with these kind of perceptions about use, because we're almost forced into using these things. And essentially these sort of perceptions then feed into actual use. There have actually been more updated models of this, which sort of integrate much more of the literature on this area, because this model's been applied so many different times with additional stuff added on and taken off. So more recently, the technology integration model was developed as a mechanism to kind of draw together and, as the title suggests, to integrate some of these understandings. So we have these sort of theoretical models that help us understand why we might sort of start to choose particular softwares or types of technology, for example, in learning and teaching in the first place. But there are questions we need to ask in relation to this. And one is, well, why do we use certain platforms over others? What are our decision-making processes on why we might choose, for example, Microsoft Teams over Collaborate or Zoom or whatever? But importantly, from a student's perspective, I suppose the question we need to be asking is, how much autonomy do our students actually have in that decision-making process? And I think this will vary quite considerably. So when we're thinking about what these perceptions are around use, possibly a lot of the time we're sort of only focusing on what we as educators perceive to be useful and easy to use. We perhaps are missing out on understanding from our students' perspective. They may find it easy to use, for example, but they might not think it's useful. So how do we kind of then induct our students and, of course, our colleagues into this acceptance process? Why we might be using certain platforms? And what use is it going to be for learning? Because again, all part of this is about acceptance and about social norms around whether we use things or not and how we end up using them and whether they're useful or not. So there's some sort of ongoing, even basic questions to be asked there in relation to this issue. that brings us on to the second one about this idea of online behaviours and behaviours and interactions as being some ways we can understand this sort of generic term of sort of technology and internet use. And this basically relates to the type of behaviours we do, how we interact in using certain devices or technology. Now this is what, just bear with me on this is where it gets a little bit sort of left field. So when we want to understand, if we're looking at it in a really intricate way, when we're looking at online behaviour and interactions, this can occur on many, many different levels. So any kind of technology we're using, there'll always be a particular drive for why we might be using it. So this might be serving a social need, we might be using it for educational purposes, information, whatever. But there'll be various different types of interactions that we have. Some of those will be on the device level. So whether it's a smartphone you're using to access that, whether it's a laptop, a tablet, etc., etc. And some of those will be at the software level, and arguably that's the more interesting level to us as educators. So I've just given some examples of the types of behaviours or interactions we might be interested in to understand this. So for example, we might be wanting to understand how what somebody's last access to Blackboard might have been a virtual learning environment. You know, have they completed some online tasks that we've asked them to do, using analytics from things like Teams or Blackboard to understand what we call engagement. So there's a number of things that we can use in perhaps quite a useful way in some cases to understand things that are interesting to us as educators. I just wanted to very briefly just give some kind of examples from, I suppose, the cyber psychology literature to indicate why these kind of behaviours are quite interesting psychologically. Again, it's going off a little bit tangent, but I think it's kind of interesting research. So even at a device level, we can actually understand quite a lot about people quite accurately. So this research, for example, suggested that even looking at things like somebody's operating system they use, you can actually really quite accurately determine some characteristics about them. So for example, if you're an iPhone user, you are statistically more likely to be of the female identified gender, to be younger in age, to have lower honesty and humility, and to be higher in terms of emotionality. So even at that really, really basic level, we can deduce things about people from this. Going into a little bit more intricacy, this research actually was looking at device level behaviours such as things like how often you might have the screen on, or how many times you might access photo galleries on your phone, or how much you might check Facebook Messenger, all the sorts of apps that you might be using. And you can actually tell to some level of accuracy how what people's personality traits are by these different device level behaviours. And these are just some examples here. So for example, you can tell how agreeable somebody is based on how many times they might check their phone, just to see if they've got notifications, for example. And, can tell something quite interesting from people about these sorts of things. However, we might be more interested in things like the software level kind of interactions and behaviours. So I've written recently about how this relates to things like social media. So it's not just thinking about social media use or technology use as a very generic kind of term. What we're really drilling down is understanding what the constituent behaviours and types of interactions might be, which help us understand something, in this case, about how social people might be being on these platforms. So we can look at understanding, actually, we have different levels of how active or passive people might be, but not just in terms of how often they use their phone or whether they use it or not categorically, but based on the types of activities they do. So if you're engaged in more bi-directional live communication, you might be deemed as being more of an interactive social media user, for example, than if you're kind of more reacting to what people do or just look at what people do. So this is going off a little bit off tangent, but is really just illustrating the point that when we want to think about technology use and online behaviours, this actually means a lot of different things. It's actually really quite complex. These sorts of things actually, are much more intricate perhaps than we possibly realise. So I suppose some of the kind of things that are relevant for us to think about really in this particular context is, what are the particular behaviours we're looking for and that students can evidence, which can help signal pedagogic success, or what we might deem success. So how How do we induct our students to know that behaviours can help them indicate that they're motivated or that they're engaged? How do we communicate that to students effectively so that they know how to demonstrate that? Again, I think there's been quite a bit of disparate practice on how that's communicated to students. We might know what we're looking for, but are we actually engaging our students in understanding that? And I think one of the most important questions for me as well, and something I've been really mindful of throughout the last year or so, is how do we use these behaviours in a kind of ethical and transparent way? You know, are our students aware that we're making use of these sorts of behaviours, like analytics, for example, last access point, as a way of understanding engagement, this term that we keep coming back to? So I think there's really important questions we need to keep asking and keep kind of having a framework for knowing how to address if we're continuing on this kind of strategy. And then finally, that brings us to this issue of engagement. And this is where, for me, it starts to get a little bit sticky. So we use this term engagement a lot. You know, in these kind of conferences, the term engagement crops up time and time again because it is entirely relevant to understand these things. In the context of technology and internet use, engagement means things like your experience associated with using technology, whether you continue and your willingness to continue using something. Obviously, in the kind of learning sense, it can mean something different, which I'll talk about the discrepancies there in a second. So, yes. So when we talk about engagement online, in terms of online learning, what are we actually referring to? And I would be kind of cautious in thinking that if somebody's, you know, making good use of attending live sessions, is commenting on things, does that actually mean that they're engaged in their learning? Or is it just that they're engaged with using the technology? And there's something interesting I think we really need to start teasing apart here. Technology engagement can, you know, be all these different things I've sort of briefly mentioned. It might, you know, we can understand it about uptake or continued use. Sometimes might refer to how immersed or involved people might be psychologically. But when we think about learning engagement, this is where we know that there are different facets of engagement. We've normally been talking about behavioural engagement, so things like, are people turning up to online sessions or on-campus sessions? Are they contributing to discussion boards or the comments in things like team meetings? Have they accessed the VLE? But of course, engagement can mean more things than this. We have emotional engagement, we have cognitive engagement, and these aren't necessarily always evident in our behaviours, because otherwise they'd be behavioural engagement, I guess. So I think there's a really important question here. Well, two important questions here is, are we capturing everything about how engaged our students are by just looking at these kind of really minute behavioural interactional sorts of things that are happening? And B, are we actually measuring learning engagement, or are we just measuring technology engagement? I've put a reference to a study at the bottom here, and this was quite interesting because this was a paper that was done a few years ago, and they looked at, this was a fully online class, but it was done in an asynchronous way. And they looked at both instructors and students, different types of engagement based on the way they contributed to discussion forums, and they could take indicators of the different types of engagement, so behavioural, cognitive and emotional. So they kind of used sort of ways of actually understanding different types of engagement, from things like, you know, how much self-reference points they were in the text, for example, or, you know, how long the kind of discussion posts were. So it's looking something beyond just the actual technological behaviour itself, was looking at the intricacies of what was said and how it was said. So, you know, it's something interesting there about what that might reveal, maybe more about engagement than just looking at behaviours as being discrete kind of things. So I think this raises a number of questions. So I guess generally, you know, if we're looking at engagement and as being this kind of what our psychological experiences are with using, you know, doing online learning, then we want to understand, well, you know, is the platform, or are the platforms we're using actually positive and beneficial, not just for students, but also for educators as well? To what extent can these sort of online behaviours, so these kind of, you know, accessing Blackboard, all these kind of things, what are they actually telling us about engagement? To what extent can they tell us about this fully? And is what we're measuring anything about learning engagement, or is it just technology engagement? And this is a kind of critical question, really. So, summary to this point, before we move on to the next issue, which will hopefully resolve some of these issues. So this idea of technology and online engagement and or use is actually much more complex than we might sort of think on the surface. We are obviously probably most interested in this idea of engagement. We want to know that our students are wanting to learn, that they are learning, that they're engaging with each other, with us, with content, etc. But I think what's happened is, as we've sort of shifted quite prominently to doing a lot of online learning and teaching, maybe what we've been doing is actually only measuring behavioural engagement because of those, looking at those kind of specific interactions and behaviours. Using things like analytics, and it might not be the full extent of engagement that we're actually measuring. It might just be telling us one smallish, large, I don't know, proportion of what engagement is more generally. So we have to remember that engagement is multifaceted, and to what extent can we actually capture and encourage all these different types of engagements, not just at the kind of behavioural level. So I think we've kind of put the spotlight on behavioural engagement and kind of, to some extent, maybe sideline some of the other aspects of this which are still important. So I'm now going to move on and think, well, there are perhaps ways we can actually foster other types of engagement, like emotional engagement. And this actually might be part of the solution to kind of broaden out some of these issues, and might be part of the solution for making blended provision actually quite more successful, or continue to be successful. Okay, you're kind of staying with me so far. So we now move on to this idea of connection. And this, I think, is part of how we can understand how emotional engagement can be fostered. I want you to just have a moment just to have a think about this. You don't necessarily have to share anything on the chat. I just maybe want you to just have a think about this for a minute or so. Are you a member of a social group? So this might be some kind of club, or it might be a community thing, whatever it might be. It might be an online thing, doesn't really matter. I want you to just sort of think, maybe think of one group that you might be part of or affiliate with. Then I want you to have a think about quantifying, how central that is to you in terms of your identity. So if you were to describe yourself to somebody who you'd never met before, how much are you likely to use it as a description of yourself, or to mention it that you might be part of this group? And then finally, have a think about what are the different behaviours that you do that are kind of correspond with that identity. So, is it that you visit somewhere once a week, or, do you, have t-shirts or things that might be related to this? So just going to give you a little bit of time just to have a think about that. And then we'll come back to it and talk about how that's relevant in a moment. Okay, so hopefully you've had a little bit of a chance to think about some of those things. So the example I was thinking about when I was doing this, putting this talk together, is one part of my identity, I guess, is I'm a singer. So I'm a member of a couple of choirs, one called Sing It Big and one called Decibels. And I was thinking, well, there might be differences actually in how central, but each of those are to my identity, that sort of singing identity, based on how long I've been a member of those and how much they might feel like a family or a community. And I've just thought these are some of the behaviours that might be relevant there. Now, there's some of these where that identity to that domain is going to be more salient and more relevant. So during times when we're actually allowed to rehearse in the same room as other people, obviously not allowed to at the moment, then that identity, that singing identity, is going to be really, really, really strong, going to be really, really central. Whereas now, at this moment in time, although I'm thinking about it at the moment, it's probably not actually that salient. It's a little weaker, but it's still part of me. It's still part of my identity. So there's something interesting here about identity and connection, and how this might in many ways be very fluid across contexts. Again, I'll make sure this is relevant in a minute as we get to the next part. Now, psychology is really cool because it tells us a lot about things like human connection and relatedness and why it might be important. And there's many different psychological theories that help us understand this. And the one particularly I want to kind of draw attention to is this idea of what we call social identity theory. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. And essentially, it helps us understand that the way we connect to each other, with each other, actually happens on numerous levels. And a lot of the time, this doesn't have to be the time, when we're actually just talking with other people or having these interactive kind of conversations. We can still feel a sense of connection and engagement with each other, even if we're not together, even if we're not co-located. And we can have this cross-context transfer. So again, we might have a more salient identity in that a domain relevant place, but that doesn't mean that's still not part of how we feel connected with other people and to certain things. So I think there's some key implications of here, how this is relevant for things like emotional engagement. So social identity theory essentially suggests that the way we define ourselves is often based on our group membership. So, for example, some of the ideas you might have come up with will be some examples of the social identities that you might have. And essentially this suggests that if you promote a social categorization to that particular social group, then you start defining yourself rather in singular terms as I and me, but you more use collective terms such as we and our. So where you've got that sense of categorization, that's where you see the kind of collectivity being more evident. And then we have another process of social identification, and this is where you start to see that the more that identity is salient or central to you, the more you're likely to conform with the values or behaviours associated with that social group. So, for example, a member of a choir, I'm more likely to, attend rehearsals, or I might be part of WhatsApp groups more likely than, would be if I wasn't in a membership of that. I might, attend more concerts myself to watch it because it's, singing's interesting to me. So you start to pick up the values and behaviours associated with that. So there's something important here about thinking to what extent, if we were to promote this sort of identity to learning context, to course related things, can this be part of the solution to how we foster this sort of emotional engagement and connection, not just with other people, but to institutions or to campuses, for example. So there's some implications here about how it relates to online learning. So what we know from psychology is that social identity actually is really important. So this is just a visual summary of a load of different research papers, but basically we know that it can relate to psychological outcomes. So the more positive and strong your collective identity is to a certain domain, the more that's likely to relate positively to things like self-esteem. You might feel less lonely, you might feel like you have a greater sense of belonging, happiness, well-being, all these kind of things. But we know, particularly in organisational settings, this actually works at a behavioural level as well. It can promote things like motivation, or how much you believe that there's group efficacy with the people you work with, performance, all these kind of things. So actually, it seems to be like it could be quite interesting to think about the implications of this, again, to promote this sense of connection and engagement more so than just up to behavioural level. So, oh yeah, I forgot I was going to take this out because it distracts me along a little bit, but just to kind of give an example. So we looked a few years ago, looked at this in relation to online gaming. So the key thing here is that we looked particularly on how your sense of identity as an online gamer related to some of these outcomes. And generally, the more involvement people had here, the more they had that sense of being a gamer, and that was related favourably to a number of different outcomes. So even this can be established predominantly just online. It doesn't have to be the people you are co-located with. You can still gain this sense of connection through a number of different ways that you involve yourself in different things. So getting onto the more direct and relevant things. So this was something that we, a couple of years ago, actually looked at in my department. And we recognised that when our students came in their first year, they were coming in really big cohorts of about 250 students, which isn't uncommon actually, particularly for psychology courses. And what we wanted was to actually allow them a bit more of a stronger social glue with a smaller, what we call cluster of their peers. So we actually kind of had a strategy whereby we divided up our students into these smaller constituent clusters. So there were about 15 students per group. And what we did was situate these as part of our personal tutoring system. So for each cluster, there were 2 full-time academic members of staff from the department who were the personal tutors for half of the students in that cluster. And we use this sort of social identity kind of intervention as a way of trying to bolster cluster identity. So try and foster this sort of social glue to help our students feel more connected and a sense of belonging in something in a smaller, more manageable way than to, say, the department, which was really big, or the university, which was even bigger. So it was almost taking on the principle of like Hogwarts houses, basically. So you have values and behaviours associated with maybe those different houses, and that's sort of part of what kind of helps you kind of glue together a little bit. So what we did for this was actually a number of different activities over the first year of our students' first year of their course. So right in Freshers Week, we actually started the social categorisation process, and this was facilitated by tutors in the clusters, but very much led by students themselves. So what we wanted to do was try and foster this sort of social categorisation, so this sense of collectiveness within clusters. So we asked our students to try and establish what the similarities were with each other, and so use post-it notes basically to try and in relation to different prompts that we gave them. And then that sort of supported the second part of this, whereby we asked them to then kind of cluster them under different sort of headings, I guess, where we could then use that as a way of just, you know, talking through and demonstrating what the commonalities were across them to try and initiate this sort of categorisation process. Now, just to say, this was very much pre-COVID times, but actually this kind of activity could still actually work really well if you just did it online. So there's tons of different software, for example, where you could actually do this really quite effectively, I think, online. So there's just some examples there, but obviously the range of other platforms that could be helpful for this. And again, might be a way that you could have that kind of cross transfer. You could do this bit online and then other bits offline, for example. And then we went to the second part of the process. So in the sort of second session, we then sort of tried to initiate the kind of social identification process. And for this, we actually used a kind of collective goal setting strategy. So we asked our students to come up with a general outcome goal that they, as their cluster, wanted to be able to achieve, and, you know, did all sorts of resourcing with them about how to set SMART targets and things like this. And then they basically, over the following sessions, really tried to review these and evaluate the extent to which they'd met these or not. So it was very much a cluster-based activity that they worked together and had shared collective targets to achieve. And so the following sessions, they did all sorts of things like identify to what extent had they met their target, if not, why not. We brought in all sorts of stuff about different biases that might have hindered or helped progress on that. So we brought the kind of psychology of this in, and just allowed them opportunities to do this kind of collective stuff together. Yeah, and that was the next session. So what we found actually when we evaluated this is that the strength of cluster identity very much related on a psychological level. So the more strong they felt they identified with their specific cluster, the more that was related positively to their efficacy about the other people in their cluster, the group efficacy beliefs, their sense of belonging and happiness in their first year of study. We didn't find any actual performance outcomes, but the fact we found some sort of psychological things that was really interesting. So, you know, there's something there that's, you know, important perhaps in that kind of social gluing connection. By the way, if you want a copy of the resources we used for these training sessions, I'll put a link to my website after I've finished blabbing on, and you can access those freely if you would wish to have them. Okay, so implications of this, just sort of wrapping up then. So where there's shared or collective identity present, then basically connection can very much be developed and maintained. And again, this doesn't have to be just situated by the context that those students might have been in. So even if they've done some of those initial activities online, if you've established that connection and identity, that can be fluid. And that can be really quite beneficial when we're thinking about this in the context of blended learning. And we use particularly collective goal setting as our strategy to foster this kind of collective identity, but there might be other, you know, range of other strategies that can be helpful for that. And particularly the students who kind of elected to do goals that were kind of academic or course related were the ones that, you know, seemed to have the best sort of outcomes with these sorts of things. They could choose their own goals. So there was better buy-in when it was something that was kind of relevant for all of them. So what are the implications generally then? So thinking generally about some of the insights that we've thought about. this idea of looking at technology and internet use, it's not just, you know, the term use actually means a lot of things. It can be those specific behaviours, it can be your adoption, it can be the engagement. These are quite different things. And if we've been relying on these very specific behaviours or interactions from things like the analytics from platforms, maybe this is only telling us about behavioural engagement. And what might be missing there is these broader types of engagement, such as emotional engagement or cognitive engagement. And part of the solution to that might be if we can instill sort of collective identity, whether it's to the institution, to students, to each other, to their course, to whatever level. Perhaps this is part of the solution to helping that sense of connection to extend to a broader sense of engagement. So social identity theory here actually is really useful to help try and cement those connections, so it's useful across these contexts. So particularly in the context of blended education could be, you know, a really useful strategy in general. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. I have actually gone a bit longer than I was thinking I was going to, but you are very welcome to contact me. I'll put the link to my resources in the chat in a moment, but thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so opportunity for you to ask whatever questions you have in the group. I think we've got a good 10 minutes or so to do this, so please post any questions. And I think early doors, Mark Smith asked a question, and his was a reflection on, has there been much work looking into technology dependency within an academic setting? Learners fixated too dependent on the impact of on in-person interaction. Sorry, you can't see me reading. That's the challenge there, isn't it?
All right. No, it's all right. No, that's a really good question. So dependency on using the technology for learning, or just dependency more generally? Sorry, I didn't get the end of the question there. There it is, within academic setting. Oh. Dependency. Yeah, I'm not aware of anything that has done that. There's loads of research on sort of technology. I don't like using the term addiction, but it hasn't really been looked at in relation to learning and how that might then relate to people wanting to continue online. I think that's, you know, what we'll be discussing in the panel later is about student expectations around that, and whether it's going to be the case that there's now an expectation about certain types of ways we've been doing this kind of stuff, and whether actually, you know, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that comes down to what people are dependent on. Is it just the, you know, a lot of what we've been doing, of course, is providing content on demand. And is it the on-demand aspect that's going to become more dependent, or is it that there's a preference generally for being able to communicate via chat, for example, than in a seminar? So I think to understand that, I think it's a case of understanding what are the aspects that are deemed the most useful and therefore most likely to they're going to become dependent on. And us as educators as well, we might become dependent on these things. I saw something on Twitter this morning saying, how can I use this chat, these back channels in the classroom when I go back to face-to-face, because I really like this aspect of it, and how can I then translate that into the classroom? So yeah, I think there's a number of different things to unpick on that one though, but I think it's a really important consideration, definitely.
Oh, we just had a question come through from Stuart. What your view on the user experience of the technical, e.g. visual user interface, usability, accessibility, social, etc., and that human effect on reflections and outcomes? Yeah,
that's a good question. I know a lot less about the actual user experience stuff because that's slightly outside my area. But I suppose the issue of accessibility is an important one, definitely. And I think, again, this particular year, I think we've become much more mindful of that. Obviously, the legalities around that, which have been around for a number of years now. But I mean, again, this is part of the really important thing to look at when we're understanding what's effective in online learning and teaching, is about, we're not just dealing with what's effective pedagogically, but what's effective technologically as well. And if something doesn't work technologically, then that's going to have an impact pedagogically, isn't it? It's like if you were trying to buy something from an online website, if the website keeps crashing, then you're not going to be very favourable about that company, and you're not going to buy stuff from them in the future. So there's a really important thing there on how the UX around the way technological systems are designed actually does feed in really strongly to attitudes about things, about satisfaction, about psychological involvement. So it does have a key role, absolutely. We know that psychologically. How that works in online learning teaching, it's still a bit of an unknown, to be honest, as far as I'm aware. There might be stuff, but not stuff that I'm that familiar with. But very important concern, definitely.
Okay, we have another question here from Andy Everton, who's one of our College Directors of Education. Do you think that the community building is a vital precursor to engagement online, as in the face-to-face milieu?
Community building vital precursor to engagement online as the face-to-face milieu. I don't think it necessarily has to be the case that the community building has to take place in one place or the other. I think it depends what kind of community building activities are being done and whether it's relevant for a particular context, to be honest. So I think, you know, there's I mean, like the gaming stuff I very briefly touched on as an example there, is that you can build a community fully online and it works, and there's cohesiveness and there's a sense of social resources that you can get from those, and those can be positive. So I think it depends what's meaningful and relevant in those contexts, and in the context of blended learning, something like identity to an institution or to your peers, that is fluid, and that doesn't have to be just situated and relevant to a particular context. So I don't think it matters where the community building takes place, as long as it's going to be relevant there and beyond, to be honest, and what the focus is in terms of what's the community and who's in it.
Absolutely. I think we can all recognise that we're all members of a community that's facilitated online and meets face to face. Maybe not as face to face as we would like these days, but you know that it can be a fairly fluid, and we are able to adjust to the situations and get the best out of both of those. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. One of the things you mentioned earlier, whilst I'll jump in now while I ask my question, was you made the really personal point that interaction with technology isn't necessarily interaction with learning, and we've noticed, and we've done some studies ourselves that's highlighted that you can use engagement with technology as a proxy for student success, but you always get the outliers of the students who do everything and still struggle to pass, and those students who never seem to turn up and then just sail through. You always get those outliers, but as a general indication, it's fine. But you're right, it doesn't indicate necessarily engagement with learning. And given that we tend to measure what we find is measurable, how do we square that? How do we start to measure in real time engagement with learning? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, so it's a really good question. I was expecting somebody might ask that as well. And to be honest, it's only from putting together this talk I've actually really thought about these things, to be honest. So it's been useful for me. And this is where the kind of emotional engagement stuff kind of comes together a bit. And there's not necessarily an easy way to measure that. But, the example I gave with that study that looked at other indicators beyond just how much people have access, but looking at what the depth of those things are, and the level of interactions people might have, those might tell us something additional to the kind of surface level kind of behaviours. Maybe it's not an easy thing to measure, I don't think, and I don't think I've got a particularly intelligent answer to that, unfortunately. But yeah, okay. Definitely a question to move forward on, for sure.
Thank you. And ask the question, you mentioned psychological involvement. How does this differ from engagement?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there's lots of very quite similar terms which actually do mean something different. So I would argue involvement is a type of engagement, but then you have all sorts of things like immersion and flow. They are conceptualized as being different things. So involvement, I would argue, is more. I'm now trying to remember. I did do a lot of this stuff as part of my PhD years ago now, and I can't remember. I can send some really useful papers on this if anybody particularly interested.
Okay. I've got a question from Uzma. How do you think if we asked a student about his behaviour, their behaviour, engagement was measured on a 5 Likert scale, does this provide a better measurement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one because, again, engagement means different things to different people. Again, we've been kind of conflating a lot of, if somebody's turned up to a session, that means they're engaged. Well, not necessarily. They might come in and sign a register, but that doesn't mean that they're cognitively engaged. And this is why I always have an issue with using attendance as a way of monitoring students, because it doesn't tell you everything. So again, I think, typically in psychology research, to understand things like different levels of engagement, that kind of Likert scale approach would be used. But I mean, you'd have to ask it in relation to different types of things. So, to what extent are you focused on things when they're happening? It might be a level of cognitive engagement. To what extent do you turn up for sessions when they're scheduled? Would be behavioural engagement. To what extent do you feel that you're part of your learning community? Would be emotional engagement. So you can measure it. You'd have to be specific on specific items, though, in relation to the different types, I think, and it will give you some indication, I think. But maybe sometimes we don't even know how engaged we are sometimes, and that can vary considerably as well. It's not going to be a static kind of. You'd have to do it based on different contexts and maybe different modules. You have differences in students as well, in different levels of engagement. So, it's difficult to capture.
And different points within a session as well. I'm sure even today we will have had different levels of engagement with each of the sessions at different points, where just because Amazon's arrived, or because our thoughts have just gone on to the next session. It happens, and I guess it's a movable feast. Okay, so just, is there any final questions? Yes, I mean, that's just John saying can vary from one moment to the next. I think that's just what we were talking about. Yes, it absolutely can. And we can test that by me randomly picking one of the participants and asking them to ask a question, seeing how we're all engaged at this moment.
Yes.
But I would say, if there's no final questions coming through, just to say thank you, Linda. Thank you. I know you said that you'll share some stuff. That's great. If you share it with the team, we can send it out to everybody who's participated. We can take care of the admin on that, so you don't need to worry about that.
I have put the link there if people want it there as well. But yeah, okay, if you're sending stuff around as well, then I can send it on to you as well if you wish.
Yeah, that's fine. We can collate all of this. If you've already shared it, we'll pull it out of the chat, so don't you worry about that. But just to say thank you all. Excellent, really thought-provoking. And just to say that this is the end of this particular session. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock. I don't know if you've got a slide. Dan's given us all slides to put up on the screen. If you could potentially put yours up so we can highlight that. At 1 o'clock, we have in stream 1, Deborah Whelan talking about thinking with the third eye, lessons learned from the COVID-19 experience, absolutely pertinent to today. Or you can have at 1 o'clock, Katie Strudwick, who will be talking, reflecting upon the lessons of what works, developing student engagement and partnerships. So there's two very good options there. But at this point, I'll just say thank you again to Linda. I'll see you again in the panel discussion, which I'm sure we're both very much looking forward to. And please, we'll just let everyone know the microphones will be open for that session. So we will encourage a discussion. Very much want to hear from you, as much as I'm sure you would like to hear from us, or we'd like to think that you'd like to hear from us. So with that, I'll let you all have your lunch break, and I'll see you all again soon at 1 o'clock. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.